going on. I'm going to have serious problems with this. Again, this is a clear case where, okay, if you are an officially Christian state, clear answer to that one. No problem dealing with this question. If you're a secular state, what do you appeal to here? To say, yeah, we're going to allow Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and even Wiccans and others, we're going to allow all these different groups to do their services on base, but not the Satanists. What do you appeal to? Keeping faithful to the First Amendment. Well, I think there are some ways in on this. First of all, there are some real issues of safety and security, the troubling kinds of things that often happen in satanic rituals going on. Could be a sanitation issue, could be a threat to the common good. So there's those kind of things possibly, but also it does seem to be unique in that it's really there to mock Catholicism, to mock the Catholic faith. That's really what Satanists are all about. They don't kind of put forth their own religion in a unique way. If Catholicism wasn't around, they wouldn't exist, really. I mean, it's the church and Jesus Christ that they turn upside down in their worship. So, a mockery of a religion is not religion. One could argue anyway. There's some potential to answer this. This one has not quite yet happened, but boy, we're just about there. This is just around the corner. Now that Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been repealed, same-sex couples in the military begin demanding to be married on base. At Fort Swampy, none of the Catholic or Protestant chaplains are willing to perform these ceremonies. The Department of Defense orders them that they must do so, regardless of their qualms of conscience. Like I said, I don't think this is terribly far away. I'm worried for my friends that are military chaplains in this regard. I know they won't comply. It's getting harder and harder to have a clear understanding of what marriage is. And those of us who firmly have a strong conviction, I wouldn't even call it a religious belief. I mean, I don't think it's my faith that compels me to believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. I see this as natural law and obvious and apparent. But the fact is, it doesn't seem so obvious and apparent to many today, including many of my former students that I taught, and I thought I taught fairly well and fairly clearly. But as they go through the universities and are exposed to all kinds of ideas, and as they have friends who declare themselves to be gay, it's very hard for them to say, I don't approve of sexual relations between two men or between two women, but I like you and love you as a person. They can't seem to make that distinction. People under 30 are really quickly going towards wanting same-sex unions to be publicly, not just publicly accepted, but it's really becoming a civic right on the same level as the rights of blacks or of other races or the rights of women versus men. That if you oppose the rights of two men or two women to marry each other and be recognized as such, you're a bigot. And it's moving that direction. Again, in a Catholic state, easy to answer. In a secular state, you got to find how you can give these answers without having to appeal to religion. For years, federal prisons have had libraries with all kinds of books available for inmates to check out, including religious books. In recent years, jihadist Muslim clerics have pushed for converts in the prison system and have planted inflammatory tracts that have caused great concern. In response, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has ordered a purging of all federal prisons. Only books on the approved list are allowed, and many religious books have been quietly removed. A few outraged chaplains have been protesting this order. They point out that they have had certain Christian and Jewish books in their libraries for years without remotely being a threat. What should be done? This was based on a news case. I got this one about 6 years ago, I believe. And I think it's pretty obvious to most Americans that religion in this area in particular can play a very positive role. The hope anyway with our prisons is that we help these inmates to reform and live good lives. And for that very reason, they welcome in chaplains with open arms to exert a positive influence on the inmates, to help them turn from evil and do good, to help form their consciences, to help them build up ethical standards among them. All this is welcome, and Christian and Jewish literature has helped with this over the years, quite different from the other kind of religious literature, whatever group might be putting it forward, that is encouraging you to go out and kill people. And I think distinctions can be made there. Is this promoting the good of the whole society, or is this threatening it? We need not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. How about this case? A new group of Latter-day Saints in Utah wants to return to an earlier practice of polygamy and demands legal recognition of all these unions, at least in the cases where all the wives concerned are willing to sign the legal contract. They emphasize that they understand their polygamy as a matter of religious duty, should legal status be granted. So they're saying we must do this or we'll be sinning. Should the state step in and force them? Well, I think most of us would say, well, yeah, they can't allow this. And even most of my students, some of whom at the university level, at least initially, were very supportive of same-sex unions. I said, well, why do you think the state should step in here and not with 2 men or 2 women? I mean, if we are able to redefine marriage to be whatever we want it to be, and if all the parties concerned agree that this is what we want our marriage to be, we love each other, we've created this union for ourselves, recognize us, why recognize the one and not the other? I mean, I kind of use this case to prod their minds a little bit and make them think. Anyway, we'll come back to that in a moment. Final case here. This was way back when I was teaching high school, just at the state level. Now it's become much bigger, as we all know. Jane is a Catholic pharmacist. She has just finished reading John Paul II's Theology of the Body and has decided that she cannot, in good conscience, distribute contraceptives, especially those that cause early abortions. Meanwhile, the state of New Jersey passes a law requiring all pharmacies to provide so-called emergency contraception. Jane refuses and faces prosecution. Well, of course, now that's moved to a much greater level with the HHS mandate being pushed at the federal level, even upon religious employers who don't fit that narrow exemption. So these are cases that caused us to think, hopefully not too painful, but we try to identify some indispensable principles. Obviously, the one we've already talked about, religious freedom, freedom of conscience, very important principle, both of which are rooted in the dignity of each human person. And the state needs to respect the dignity of each human person. And again and again and again, the church has called for this. Yes, because the gospel commands us to respect the dignity of each human person, but we don't have to be Christians to believe this. I think deep down, most human beings know that we all have an inalienable dignity that shouldn't be taken away, shouldn't be violated. So in most cases, religious freedom and freedom of conscience should be honored. But we saw in some of these cases, sometimes the state has to step in. My students, those university students in particular, many of them came into the class just diehard proponents, separation of church and state, nothing to do with each other. The religion should stay out of public, and the state shouldn't ever meddle in religion. Well, started to realize, no, in some cases, the state does have to step in. When? Well, the common good, I think, comes up repeatedly. When the common good is threatened, the state needs to step in. If it's sufficiently threatened, we all agree, I think, now the state has to step in. September 11th, again, would have been a prime case of that if it could have been stopped. The truth is another one I would suggest. Whether moral truth, ethics, if you have a particular religious group that is violating basic moral laws, for example, a cult that's hurting children, and so on and so forth, we want the state then to step in, to intervene. We might even talk about natural law, something that's not very popular today, but I think deep down we all have certain basic moral truths that we know are true. And science too. I'll return to that in a moment, but scientifically provable facts are an objective principle the government can appeal to in saying, we will intervene here, we won't intervene here. So going back, so the first principle we've already covered: religious freedom, freedom of conscience, the dignity of each human person, the way in which coercing somebody against his conscience tends to violate that dignity because it causes the person to sin. But the common good, this is a tough one to answer. We could spend 20 sessions just trying to tackle what is the common good and still be struggling to grasp it. This is what the Catechism says. By common good is to be understood the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The common good concerns the life of all. That gives you some idea and sounds very nice. Still maybe a little vague. The Catechism does list specifically 3 characteristics. These, I think, do help sharpen this a little bit. In order to guarantee the common good, you must have respect for the human person. If the dignity of any human person is violated, the whole common good is violated. So this is really against more socialistic ways of looking at the common good, or any totalitarian government that's willing to set aside completely the dignity of some in order to preserve the whole. That is not the Christian view of the common good at all. That every human person must be respected within the common good. But the other side, too, the whole community must grow and develop. If the growth and development of the whole is threatened, the common good is threatened. Similarly, stable, just, and peaceful social order, if that becomes threatened, the common good is threatened. This gives us some sense of when is the common good threatened to the point that the state needs to step in. If one of these 3 is seriously threatened, the state needs to step in, even if religious freedom is there. Hopefully that makes enough sense. Like I said, we could go so much more in depth, but this is just painting one broad brushstroke. Just a point here, again, I told you to keep those 2 models in the back of your mind. In an officially Judeo-Christian state, it's much easier, isn't it, to define the common good. Today, in secular America, if you ask 500 Americans, what is the common good? You're going to get 500 different answers. How does our government say this is what the common good is? Your group is violating, threatening the common good, we must step in. And I read websites that said the Catholic Church is wrong and the Department of Health and Human Services is right because HHS, they're defending the common good against the evil Catholic Church. Catholic, they're appealing to the common good, but obviously a very different understanding of the common good. It's getting hard to define that, but we have to try. If we want a secular state, we have to try to identify what is the common good. Similarly, natural law. It's very important, especially in a secular state, to have some sense of natural law. From our Christian point of view, natural law is actually given to us by God. It's written on our hearts by God. As St. Paul says in Romans, ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes of eternal power and divinity have been able to be understood and perceived in what He has made. As a result, they have no excuse. He's talking about the pagans who, unlike the Jews, did not have divine revelation to help them out, to help them know the truth. All they had was their own natural knowledge. And even so, St. Paul says, they have no excuse. They should have known. And he's talking specifically about males having sex with males and females with females. He explicitly lists that in Romans as something that should be known without God having to reveal it. So read that chapter of the Bible a few times. Anyway, but looking at this from a more secular view, basic moral truths that are knowable to all. Still, thankfully, I think most Americans will agree when you press them on this, that there are some basic moral truths that we all know. That's slipping away from us, but it's still there for most people, especially when they start raising their own families and so on and so forth. Then start to get a little more clear about there are certain basic moral truths that are knowable to all. Looking at it this way, so it's not that reason and revelation go against each other. We'll get into this in the winter in one of my other talks. But There are a lot of truths that our minds can know. There are a lot of truths that God has shown us. Some we know both ways. We know them because God has shown them to us. We know them if we think about them enough. Just to suggest some of these examples of natural law, truths that we all can know if we look in our hearts honestly, that there is a God. Many thinkers over the centuries have concluded there must be a higher being. That's not the Trinity. You can't prove the Trinity. There's a lot about our Christian God that cannot be proven. That doesn't mean he's against reason. It just means he's beyond reason because he's infinite and reason is finite. There are many of the Ten Commandments. You don't have to be a Jew or a Christian to know that it's wrong to murder, to steal, to commit adultery, to rape, to commit incest, to perjure yourself. These are basic moral truths that most societies over the centuries have recognized. You might have a society here and a society there that is weak on one of these points. So is our society. But generally speaking, almost every good society recognizes these as basic moral truths knowable to all. Similarly, the dignity of each human person. This principle is only there, I would say, historically speaking, because Christians witnessed to it. It comes from Christianity. But once it's proposed, men and women of goodwill can say, yeah, that makes sense. We all have a dignity. We need to respect human dignity. And even, the Charter for Human Rights that was composed in the mid-20th century, without much reference to religion, asserted the dignity of each human person. And based on that, then, we can try to argue that without even having to say this is a Christian thing, slavery's wrong, abortion's wrong, euthanasia's wrong, assisted suicide's wrong. Each of these violate our inherent dignity as a human person and should be, once you understand what's really going on, it's self-evident that it's wrong, even without revelation. Similarly, we'll get into this in the spring, the theology of the body, the nuptial meaning of the body, love and sexuality as free, total, faithful, and fruitful. But John Paul II, a lot of his ideas that he proposed there, based on Scripture, are self-evident when you really get to look at them. They're appealing to people. And we can appeal to marriage as an important public institution between one man and one woman that does not primarily exist for the fulfillment of the man or the woman. It's not about their self-fulfillment. It's not about what they want to create for themselves. It's about family. That's what marriage has always been there for historically, without reference to religion. Family is the basic building block of society. If family life is strong, society is strong. If family life is weak, society crumbles. We all know that. And family life is only strong if marriages are strong. They're all linked together. This can be seen. I forgot to bring that pamphlet in, but there's a pamphlet I have that has dozens of reasons why marriage between a man and a woman is preferable to same-sex unions without appealing to religion. It can be done, but it's more difficult. So going back then to that mandate that is so timely, is it an egregious violation of religious freedom? Well, if you were at my talk on Saturday, you know what I think about that. But or is it a legitimate intervention for the common good, as some say? Well, obviously it violates the First Amendment, which guarantees the free exercise of religion that's being stripped away from us by this mandate. And for that reason, I pretty firmly believe the Supreme Court is going to strike it down. And I base that on last January, a 9-0 decision. Our present Supreme Court doesn't frequently rule 9-0 unless they're dealing with more obscure, unimportant cases, But when it's a real big case of religion and culture in the state, not often they're going to get a 9-0 decision, but they did. They refused to intervene in this case of a Lutheran church choosing to fire an employee and her suing them for discrimination because of her disability. I believe she had narcolepsy, if I remember right. But anyway, they said, we're not going there. Religious freedom, 9-0, leave that alone. My guess is they'll do the same with the mandate, but we'll find out in the months to come. But looking at the points we just established, what does the state appeal to? To the common good, to moral standards, and to science. The mandate cannot appeal to the common good here. That is to say, the HHS cannot claim that the common good will be seriously threatened if these institutions refuse to pay for sterilizations and emergency contraception. How does this seriously threaten the common good of the United States of America? I mean, they use a lot of rhetoric like this threatens women's health. But seriously, does this threaten the common good in a way that we must violate people's consciences and coerce them to do what they're convinced is a sin? I just don't see that here. Furthermore, they cannot claim that the Catholic objections, or any other, because we're not the only group by any means here that has conscientious objections to emergency contraception, and we'll see why, that this violates natural law or violates scientific facts. And here's where it's important to actually get into science and objective truth. And the questions emerge: when does pregnancy begin? And how does emergency contraception work? I said last week, the bishops probably wisely have chosen not to go here, not to get all public about contraception and emergency contraception and turn it into a debate about contraception, because they know the media would just crucify them over that and they would get nowhere. And I avoided that in my talk on Saturday for the same kinds of reasons. But here, you have to get into it. Ultimately, if you want to explain why is it wrong to intervene here and why is it necessary to intervene there, you have to get into the science of it. I don't see any other way. Here's a website. Actually, it became defunct because they must have stopped paying their bills. But there's this wonderful internet time machine, and you can go back and view what websites used to look like. But it was up just a few months ago. Obviously not one that likes me very much. Birth Control Watch, and it goes after any evil people that in any way oppose birth control. I'm just taking their words here. So they go into this pregnancy debate. And their claim is that scientists have long defined pregnancy as the moment of implantation. You have a fertilized egg. As soon as it implants in the lining of the woman's uterus, that's when pregnancy begins, they say. Which means, even though there's a living human being for many moments before that, they're saying pregnancy begins at the moment of implantation, which medical textbooks for many decades have defined now, as we'll see. They make an interesting argument here that because that's when the nourishment starts, that's when the woman begins to have physiological and hormonal changes, and not before. So when does she become pregnant? She becomes pregnant when there's an implanted fertilized egg. Well, we'll come back to that. But this point, they said it for me. That's why I put this up here at the bottom. How do contraceptives work? Contraceptive literature says all methods of prevent pregnancy in one of three ways: inhibiting ovulation, inhibiting sperm transport, so stopping fertilization from happening by making it difficult for the sperm to swim, and thinning the lining of the womb so that the eggs don't implant, which in other words causes a newly fertilized human being to die. They put it right here. So this whole question of when does pregnancy begin? Does it begin at the moment of implanting in the womb, or does it begin at fertilization, which I think most of us, we think, yeah, well, conception, fertilization, they're the same thing. But I would suggest this is actually a red herring. This argument, you know what a red herring is in logic, where it's a misleading argument, just like they used to use red herrings to mislead dogs on the chase. Because what really matters is, when does human life begin? That's the real question. When does human life begin? And moving back, if I take my life right now, I'm 36 years old, and I go back one moment at a time, when did I begin to exist as a human being? Well, not when I was implanted in my mother's womb. When I was fertilized. That's when I began. There's one objection here, and that is the case of identical twins. I've heard this argument made. I walked into this conference of the American Catholic Philosophical Association once, and I was all excited to go to this conference, and the first words I heard were influx of semen. And I thought, think I came into the wrong conference here. But this was a Catholic philosopher from England who was going back to Thomas Aquinas' medieval biology. He was arguing against abortion very effectively and why public policy should protect the unborn, but he was arguing in favor of the morning after pill and embryonic stem cell research. And his argument was, for the first 8 days after fertilization, it's still possible for this newly conceived embryo, or whatever we want to call it, to split and become two human beings, twins, identical twins. So he said, before that point, you only have a potential human life. Then you have an actual human life. He said, well, that's absurd. That's ridiculous. First of all, I mean, I was not an identical twin. I did not exist potentially for 8 days, and then all of a sudden, because I'm no longer able to become a twin, now I'm an actual human being. Nothing changed in me on the 8th day after fertilization. I was a human being actually from the moment of fertilization. Plain and simple. And if my mother would have killed me, I would have been dead and I would not be here. Plain and simple. So we have to think very clearly about these things. Even in the case of identical twins, let's suppose, let's suppose that Bert here suddenly split and became two Berts. Now, we'd have a very hard time explaining what happened. What the heck just happened? But what we definitely would not say is that he was just a potential human being up until that point, and now we have two actual human beings. Now, you might say, okay, is he now two new persons, and the old Bert is gone? Or is Bert still here and one new person? You know, those kind of questions are tough to answer. How do you explain it? We don't know. But definitely you have an actual life. Just like when you have an amoeba that reproduces asexually, which is exactly what twinning is. It's asexual reproduction. You have an actual amoeba that becomes two amoebas. How do you explain it? I don't know. You explain it. Is it the same amoeba and then a new one, or is it two new ones? I don't know. But it's an actual life. That's for sure. So anyway, we already went through this, I think. But just to be clear, even with the birth control pill itself, a lot of people don't understand this. It's designed to prevent a woman from ovulating, and that is largely how it works. No ovulation, no pregnancy. But sometimes she ovulates anyway, so the pill is also designed to change the mucus to prevent fertilization from happening, to make it difficult to happen. But that might still happen. The final phase is to prevent, if there is a fertilization, if there is what I would call a conception, to prevent that new human being from implanting in the wall of the mother's uterus. In other words, to cause death. Now, we don't have any way of knowing how often this happens. We don't have a camera in the womb to see if fertilization has or has not occurred, but it's already troubling in conscience. But more so with the emergency contraception, which takes the same hormones in a more intense dosage. And one possibility is it simply doesn't work because there was no chance of a pregnancy in the first place. So someone takes emergency contraception, doesn't do anything as far as that goes. It's possible that it works by preventing fertilization, because that can happen even 2 to 3 days. I can't remember the exact amount of time. I believe it's 72 hours after intercourse, because sperm can live for several days. So that's still possible, especially if the woman takes it quickly, but the longer it takes, more and more likely that if the emergency contraception works, it works by killing a newly fertilized human being, by preventing implantation. This is why we have huge qualms of conscience about this, deeply rooted in the science, not because of our religious beliefs, because the science convinces us. Furthermore, the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors used to take, promising not to harm anyone, never do harm. That's like rule number 1 of medicine. Never do harm to anyone. This is harming a human person. Not giving a pessary to cause an abortion. That line was taken out of the oath. Then now they just usually don't even take it anymore. Because many cases now, doctors are and this is the thing too with sterilization. Taking a body, in many cases, that is working exactly the way it's supposed to be working, and mutilating that, harming that. So anyway, so the conclusion here, The mandate forces many of these institutions to violate, or will force them, if it stays in effect and goes fully into effect August 1st, to violate their conscience. It's clearly against the First Amendment.